Okay, so we are going to continue with Thomas Paine's Common Sense. So, I draw my idea of the form of government from a principle in nature, which no art can overturn, viz., that the more simple anything is, the less liable it is to be disordered, and the easier repaired when disordered. And with this maxim in view, I offer a few remarks on the so much boasted Constitution of England, that it was noble for the dark and slavish times in which it was erected, is granted. When the world was overrun with tyranny, the least remove therefrom was a glorious rescue. But that it is imperfect, subject to convulsions, and incapable of producing what it seems to promise is easily demonstrated. So, Thomas Paine, his idea of the form of government. It comes from the principle that the more simple anything is, the less liable it is to be disordered. Things that are simple have fewer component parts. Fewer component parts are less likely to become disordered. Or if they do become disordered, they're easier repaired because there are fewer pieces to put back together. And so he says in this view, he wants to break down the English Constitution and to talk about it. He says that there's a time when tyranny was overrun in the world. And it was necessary at that time. Liberty expressed itself in a certain way to the minds of those who lived at that time under that tyranny. But, he says, it is imperfect. It's subject to convulsions and incapable of producing what it seems to promise. And this is not because mankind, in some sense, has progressed. In the Platonic sense, he has stepped up another rung into the clarity of reality. Liberty greets him at his new height. And now, liberty in this new form he desires. Absolute governments, though the disgrace of human nature, have this advantage with them, that they are simple. If the people suffer, they know the head from which their suffering springs. They know likewise the remedy, and are not bewildered by a variety of causes and cures. But the Constitution of England is so exceedingly complex that the nation may suffer for years together, without being able to discover in which part the fault lies. Some will say in one, and some will say in another, and every political physician will advise a different medicine. So again, I'm not exactly sure what more can be added to this paragraph. It certainly is interesting. His opinion about absolute governments, through their simplicity, it's easier to see where things go wrong. It's easier to see the chain of command. But in the Constitution of England, things have gotten complex. The nation may suffer. We can point our fingers, and yet the singular action of this pointing of the finger and the location that the pointing represents may identify something that troubles us, that causes us to suffer, and yet at the same time it doesn't quite point to the whole of it, as though our finger pointing to the problem that we can identify is insufficient. Our very scope and understanding is insufficient to understand the problem, because there is too many components, perhaps. There are too many different places that I need to point my finger to, that I need to turn my eyes to, that I need to attend my mind to make sufficient sense of this. And altogether we can go years and suffer without being able to discover, he says, in which part the fault lies. Some people will be pointing in this direction. Others will be pointing in that direction. They will say here, some others will say there. Every political physician will advise a different medicine. To continue, I know it is difficult to get over local or long-standing prejudices, yet if we will suffer ourselves to examine the component parts of the English Constitution, we shall find them to be the base remains of two ancient tyrannies, compounded with some new republican materials. And so what are these ancient tyrannies? Firstly, the remains of a monarchical tyranny in the person of the king. Secondly, the remains of an aristocratical tyranny in the persons of the peers. Thirdly, the new republican materials in the persons of the commons, on whose virtue depends the freedom of England. The first two, by being hereditary, are independent of the people. Wherefore, in a constitutional sense, they contribute nothing towards the freedom of the state. To say that the Constitution of England is a union of three powers reciprocally checking each other is farcical. Either the words have no meaning, or they are flat contradictions. To say that the Commons is a check upon the king presupposes two things. First, that the king is not to be trusted without being looked after, or in other words, that a thirst for absolute power is the natural disease of monarchy. Secondly, that the Commons, by being appointed for that purpose, are either wiser or more worthy of confidence than the crown. Okay, so let's jump into this. The first two, he says, by being hereditary, are independent of the people. So what does this mean? So the first one being the monarchy, the person of the king, and second, the aristocracy, the person of the peers, the nobility. Hereditary being passed down by bloodlines, through heritage. They are independent of the people. And so what does this mean? To at one time have a body that we can call England, and yet within this body we can have a separation, independence between its component parts, between the monarchy and the republican elements, or the persons of the commons. And I would say that the monarchy and the aristocracy are this sort of combined mass in some sense. And so therefore, if they are to be separated and yet united in a body, they have to control the inferior elements in this case. Not in the absolute sense. Not saying in the absolute morality of the situation that the republican elements are lesser than the monarchy or the aristocracy. In some ways they are, but certainly not in all ways. And so in order to maintain this unity and retain the body that is England, the nation of England, the commons have to be controlled. Their opinions have to be not necessarily mitigated, but they have to be subject. They have to be secondary. They cannot be primary. They have to be secondary to the hereditary classes, the king, the aristocracy, the rich families, the remnants of the feudal age in which the landowners had the serfs work their land. And of course, the landowners themselves would war among each other, the serfs having no say in it, sort of the unwilling passengers of that enterprise. So he continues, and he says that in a constitutional sense, they contribute nothing towards the freedom of the state. And of course, in the constitutional sense, at the bare bones, if we are to understand that if we are to have a constitution of liberty, they can't contribute this. They can't contribute to this, because they are inherently separated from the large body, the Republican materials. To say that the Constitution of England is a union of three powers reciprocally checking each other is false, is a farce. Either words have no meaning, or they are flat contradictions. It's sort of a humorous statement there. To say that the Commons is a check upon the king presupposes two things, and I think this is particularly interesting here because it's not quite obvious what he means. That the king is not to be trusted without being looked after. Or in other words, that a thirst for absolute power is the natural disease of monarchy. So let's reflect on the implications. So that if it is the case that we have in our system of government a check upon the king by the Commons, we have that so that we can ensure that the king is faithful to his subjects. We ensure that the king does not have absolute authority over his subjects, which of course does imply that there is the possibility that the kingship, the monarchy, may write into law pieces of legislation or perform actions against the Commons that are antagonistic to the thriving of that body, or the body as a whole. Perhaps it's not necessarily that it presupposes that a thirst for absolute power is the natural disease of monarchy, but rather it leaves it open to disease, where it otherwise would not have to. Secondly, that the Commons, by being appointed for that purpose, are either wiser or more worthy of confidence than the Crown. Another interesting statement here, that the Commons, by being appointed for that purpose, for checking the king, are either wiser or more worthy of confidence than the Crown. Again, I think this is one of the cases that it's certainly possible. It's a matter of possibilities. The reason you have a check is just in case. It's not the abject assumption that the king is corrupt or the institution of the monarchy is corrupt, nor does it presuppose that the Commons are the wise entities in this scenario. It just ensures that one body can have influence over another in this reciprocal fashion. He continues, but as the same constitution which gives the commons a power to check the king by withholding the supplies, gives afterwards the king a power to check the commons by empowering him to reject their other bills. It again supposes that the king is wiser than those whom it has already supposed to be wiser than him, a mere absurdity. So is this. In principle, it seems like it's a good idea to have a check on authority so it doesn't become tyrannical. But under this system, it's a layering of a cake of redundancy, it seems. Because on one hand, the commons have the power to check the king by withholding substance, by withholding material, perhaps, something that's needed by the king. And afterwards, the king is given the power to check the commons by being able to reject their bills. So what does it mean then? You withhold their supplies? Okay, I reject the bills that you put forth. It again supposes that the king is wiser than those whom it is already supposed to be wiser than him. Or, perhaps not wiser, but it supposes the possibility, it supposes the understanding that the disease can creep in. The disease of tyranny. There is something exceedingly ridiculous in the composition of monarchy. It first excludes a man from the means of information, yet empowers him to act in cases where the highest judgment is required. The state of the king shuts him from the world, yet the business of the king requires him to know it thoroughly. Wherefore, the different parts, by unnaturally opposing and destroying each other, prove the whole character to be absurd and useless. So I wonder here if there is not a bit of a I'm imagining a substance that's diluted, in that its contents are not as concentrated as they might otherwise be. And so, for example, here he says, there's something exceedingly ridiculous in the composition of monarchy. And then he goes on to give a few examples. But monarchy can exist in a few different forms, I think. Perhaps not, perhaps I'm wrong, perhaps it all boils down to the same thing. I don't really know, but in my mind, I'm thinking about an absolute monarchy and a constitutional monarchy. And I separate these things in my mind, where an absolute monarchy is completely top-down, and that there is no input from the commons. There is no body. There is no Republican materials, no Republican elements, no representative elements to represent the commons. And then in the constitutional monarchy, in which the light of liberty barely shines through, or perhaps it shines through, gives some authority, some constitutional authority, some authority bound by law, authority under God, perhaps, to have some sort of representation in the government, to share this space with the monarchy, with the monarch, with the king. And so he says it excludes a man from the means of information, yet empowers him to act in cases where the highest judgment is required. So here it sounds like England's present case a present condition in the late 18th century, a constitutional monarchy in which man does have a role to play in this government, but the king holds the executive decisions, the information for these executive decisions. The state of the king shuts him from the world. It blinds his eyes to the information necessary to give his input into how best to improve his condition and to make appropriate judgments as to how best preserve the body that is England, to preserve the state, to understand the state and its relationship with other states, to understand the component parts of his own state. And he says, "The state of the king shuts him from the world, yet the business of the king requires him to know it thoroughly. Wherefore, the different parts, by unnaturally opposing and destroying each other, prove the whole character to be absurd and useless." So you have a bit of an antagonistic body. Two forces in opposition. Of course, I think they come from a place of good intention. It is the attempt of liberty to break through. And yet it is hindered by conflict. It is hindered by the chains of tradition would not be the correct word here. It is hindered by the overgrowth of time, perhaps, as a manicured landscape turns into a disordered landscape given time and without care. Some writers have explained the English Constitution thus: the king, say they, is one, the people another. The peers are a house in behalf of the king, the commons in behalf of the people. But this has all the distinctions of a house divided against itself. And though the expressions be pleasantly arranged, yet when examined, they appear idle and ambiguous. And it has always happened that the nicest construction that words are capable of, when applied to the description of something which either cannot exist or is too incomprehensible to be within the compass of description, will be words of sound only. And though they may amuse the ear, they cannot inform the mind, for this explanation includes a previous question. How came the king a power by which the people are afraid to trust, and always obliged to check? Such power could not be the gift of a wise people, neither can any power which needs checking be from God. Yet the provision which the Constitution makes supposes such a power to exist. So let's break this down. Some writers have explained the English Constitution in this way. The king is one, and he is separated from the people. The peers, or the aristocracy, are a house in behalf of the king. Okay, so this subclass of the king, this hereditary class that is subordinate to the king. The commons are, of course, in behalf of the people. And so what we have here is a body of citizens of a state in a seemingly separate institution, a somewhat of a growth on society. I wouldn't go as far to say yet that is a cancerous growth, because certainly they have a function. There is a role that they have to play. And I can imagine a case at one time where the very idea of a body of men to represent themselves on that stage, at that level of understanding, of organizational understanding, may have been so limited that a small group of people may have been the sole arbiters, the sole people that were able to handle that type of responsibility. Now, this sort of thing can easily be turned into a tyranny. Certainly it can in the case of people who know better, who are able to govern themselves, or at least able to have a say in how they are governed, as it is in this case. But this has all the distinctions of a house divided against itself. Of course, you have the majority of the people, the majority of the souls in the nation are separate from the ruling class, the hereditary class. And why? And though the expressions be pleasantly arranged, yet when examined, they appear idle and ambiguous. And so what does he mean by expressions here? Does he mean the expressions of man in terms of this level of organization? Does he mean the expressions of the house within the governing body, that of the king's subordinates or his peers, the aristocracy, and the commons that make up this body? Is it their interaction, specifically, these expressions, be pleasantly arranged? And yet when these expressions are examined, they appear idle and ambiguous, uncertain, open to interpretation. And it will always happen that the nicest construction that words are capable of, when applied to this description of something which either cannot exist or is too incomprehensible to be within the compass of description, will be words of sound only. In other words, they will have no meaning. They will have no weight behind them. And though they may amuse the ear, they cannot inform the mind. And so there you go. They may amuse the ear, they may entertain the more superficial aspects of our conscious mind or our base senses. They may flutter the heart, but they cannot inform the mind. For this explanation includes a previous question. How came the king by a power which the people are afraid to trust and always obliged to check? An interesting question. Some possible answers to this might be: the king may have, in the past, used his power unwisely, has abused his trust in the people. Certainly, there are cases in which I may be afraid of something that is unreasonable. I have no reason to be afraid of it because I don't understand it. In other cases, and I would venture to say in most cases, the reasons why I am afraid of something is because there is either good reason to be afraid of it, or because I have some past experience, personally, to be afraid of it. And I can imagine in this situation of the same applying. And so in this case, it is necessary to check it, by either good reason or because of past experiences. Such a power could not be the benefit of a wise people, neither can any power which needs checking be from God. So an interesting statement here. Such a power could not be the gift of a wise people. Neither can any power which needs checking be from God. Because if it was a power from God, it would not need to be checked. That power is absolute. It is. It is what it is. It is truth. Full stop. Yet the provision which the Constitution makes supposes such a power to exist. And what power is this? What power that is alluded to in the Constitution is this? A power to check. So how has one person found themselves in a position in which the people cannot trust, a position that is fit for a god, and yet reduced to the throne of a human being? How are we supposed this power to exist? But the provision is unequal to the task. The means either cannot or will not accomplish the end, and the whole affair is a felo de se. For as the greater weight will always carry up the less, and as all the wheels of the machine are put in motion by one, it only remains to know which power in the Constitution has the most weight, for that will govern. And though the others, or a part of them, may clog, or, as the phrase is, check the rapidity of its motion, yet so long as they cannot stop it, their endeavors will be ineffectual. The first moving power, will at last have its way, and what it wants in speed is supplied by time. So in this equation, in which there is an inequality, an unequalness, the provision being unequal to the task, my interpretation here may be a bit off, but if the provision is to be a power that is given to the king, that is in some sense equivalent to the power of a god, is unequal to the task. The means either cannot or will not accomplish the end. That is, the kingship will not reach high enough to the standard that is required of it, and the whole affair will be a suicide. For, as the greater weight will always carry up the less, and as all the wheels of the machine are put in motion by one, it only remains to know which power in the Constitution has the most weight, for that will govern. And though the others, or a part of them, may clog, or, as the phrase is, check the rapidity of its motion, yet so long as they cannot stop it, their endeavors will be ineffectual. That is, they may be represented, but whatever part of this whole holds the power, the throne, the provision, the first moving power will, at last, have its way, and want its wants in speed, and what it wants in speed is supplied in time. So, whereas in the old days the absolute monarchy what they want can be put into action in the constitutional monarchy, it's complicated. It's complicated by the checks, the clog, the check on the rapidity of its motion. Yet the motion itself cannot be stopped, even if it is slowed. And so this is the fundamental unfortunate quality of England's condition. Liberty has broken through to a certain degree, but it has not dissolved the absolute power which should be relegated to God. It is still bound up within the aristocracy, the monarchy, the king. It's still within the throne of man. He continues that the crown is this overbearing part in the English Constitution needs not be mentioned, and that it derives its whole consequence merely from being a giver of places and pensions is self-evident. It is corrupt. Wherefore, though we have been wise enough to shut and lock the door against absolute monarchy, we at the same time have been foolish enough to put the crown in possession of the key. So, we have closed the door to the absolute tyranny. We have introduced the checks against the absolute. And yet, the absolute remains. All we have done is slowed it down. The prejudice of Englishmen in favor of their own government by kings, lords, and commons arises as much or more from national pride than reason. Individuals undoubtedly safer in England than in some other countries. But the will of the king is as much the law of the land in Britain as in France, with this difference that instead of proceeding directly from his mouth, it is handed to the people under the more formidable shape of an Act of Parliament. So here we can see where the confusion might come in. So the king sort of disperses his word through the eyes, ears, mouth of the Parliament, of his peers. It's more difficult to point the finger at just what is causing the problem. For the fate of Charles I has only made kings more subtle, not more just. Wherefore, laying aside all national pride and prejudice in favor of modes and forms, the plain truth is that it is wholly owing to the constitution of the people, and not to the constitution of the government, that the crown is not as oppressive as in England as in Turkey. Perhaps a state of absolutism versus this diluted version, this constitutional monarchy that includes the will of the people. An inquiry into the constitutional errors in the English form of government is at this time highly necessary. For as we are never in a proper condition of doing justice to others, while we contribute under the influence of some leading particularity, so neither are we capable of doing it to ourselves while we remain fettered by any obstinate prejudice. And as a man who is attached to a prostitute is unfitted to choose or judge of a wife, so any preposition in favor of a rotten constitution of government will disable us from discerning a good one. So, despite my terrible reading, let's unpack this. For as we are never in a proper condition of doing justice to others, while we continue under the influence of some leading particularity. Let's say under the influence of some leading individual. Because how are we supposed to do justice when we are subject to another? How are we supposed to do justice to others when we ourselves are subject to another? So neither are we capable of doing it ourselves while we remain fettered or chained by any obstinate prejudice. So while under this condition, under this chain, we remain selfishly ignorant, and we are ourselves incapable of true justice. And as a man who is attached to a prostitute is unfitted to choose or judge of a wife, because a man who is attached to a prostitute is attached to his sexual-based desires, the physical desires, and such a man is not fit to judge for himself a wife. Because a wife, it implies the institution of marriage. And the institution of marriage is based on love. It is based on commitment and discipline. And while he is not committed to that, he's not committed to love, he's not committed to discipline, he's not committed to truth, to unity, he's unfit to judge. So any prepossession in favor of a rotten constitution of government will disable us from discerning a good one.